So, what we're going to do this evening is the second half of something that we began last week, which was on the Ark, the altar, relics and vessels. Now, we did a little bit on relics last week, but we've got a little bit more to say about them this week. In fact, there's plenty to say about relics, as we'll find out. Today we're going to look at relics, the Grail and holy vessels. Now, last week, we looked at the significance of the Ark of the Covenant, and we looked at its relationship to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and we looked at its relationship to the altar. As you can see here, it's the altar of St. Thomas's Church on the right-hand side with the two candles there. And we discovered that the Christians of the past, and maybe actually many Christians in the present, have a very different relationship with physical things or with possessions than our secular capitalist culture does. For Christians, human remains or objects associated with devotion or the liturgy or holy books, holy places, they possess a sort of dignity or almost a sort of autonomy of their own. They're not things to be grasped. They're not just convenient visual aids or handy tools to focus people's attention like a snappy logo or something like that. All of these things that we're talking about are relational. They're calling us to reflect on our past. They're calling us to reflect on the ways in which God moves in creation in a way that's independent of our little thought processes that go on in our head. God saw all that God had made and said that it was good. And that goodness means that we approach the created order things that we make ourselves with honour and respect and relationality, not all about possession and grasping. We also discovered that the Ark of the Covenant and the altar, and even Mary herself, possess this certain sort of power or attraction precisely because they empty themselves. They're exercising a sort of power of emptying, just like Jesus on the cross, who emptied himself and took on the form of a servant, or the empty tomb. All of these things empty themselves to give life to the world. And today we're going to see that the same is true when it comes to relics, which we're going to look at in more details, as I said, when it comes to the Holy Grail and the vessels that are used in Holy Communion. Now, one of the earliest records of a miracle that's associated with relics comes from the Bible. So we're not just talking about some fancy schmancy Roman Catholic Eastern Orthodox superstition thing here. We're talking Scripture. And here it is in Scripture. It's found in 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 20 to 21. Elisha died and was buried, and Moabite raiders came in the spring. And once, when some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly a group of raiders came upon them. They threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb, but when the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood on his feet. So, as you can see here the raiders coming in on the left-hand side, here the Moabites, and here I think is the deceased. Or this could be the man who sprung back to life again, do you think? And this one here has just tried to bury him. And here's Elisha, maybe. Who knows? It's something along those lines anyway. Not only that, you might think, oh, that's just a silly Old Testament story, you know. Well, here you go. Acts 19, 11 to 12. This is a translation, The Message. Some of you might have come across this translation of the Bible. It's a sort of colloquial translation. God did powerful things through Paul, things quite out of the ordinary. The word got round and people started taking pieces of clothing, handkerchiefs and scarves and the like that had touched Paul's skin, and then touching the sick with them. The touch did it. They were healed and they were whole. So there seems to be some sort of dynamic here, even in a tertiary relic. We'll discover what that is in a minute. Last week, we looked at the connection between the altar and relics. And even in very, very early Christian times, an agape meal was held on the grave of a departed martyr on the anniversary of the death. But as Christians gradually began to grow in number and take over large basilica public buildings, very often the body or parts of the body of a martyr were placed underneath the holy table as tangible ways to sort of connect the Christian dead with the death and resurrection of Christ, especially Christian martyrs. So you can see this practice even today, not only in the entire bodies of certain saints that are placed underneath the altar, as you can see here, very often behind a glass screen, but also in the practice of putting little relics under the altar stone. I think I have another full-scale body here, though this one's cast in bronze. What the altar boy makes of having to kneel next to that, I'm not really quite sure, but perhaps he's had some good teaching about it. Everything's all very jolly. And it's not just complete bodies that are placed there, but sometimes little bits of scraps of various different saints, as you can see here. This is an altar stone. We looked at this last week. It's a large slab of stone with a hole drilled in it, which is then filled with the relics of the saints. The hole is sealed, and then this altar stone is placed in the middle sometimes of a wooden altar, sometimes in the middle of a stone altar even, because it's removable and you can take it away and celebrate communion somewhere else with it, if you like. Now, I think this placing of these relics of the saints under the altar refers to two things in the liturgy. First of all, it's this strong association that you get between what happens on the altar. This is the redeeming act of Christ being celebrated in communion, the defeat of death, as we're reminded. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And a connection between Christ's death and resurrection and the resurrection of all believers at the end of time. So death will have no more dominion. And just like Christ, we will rise again. So these two images show you. On the left-hand side there, this is a little artwork that's on the side of an altar. So you can see they're strongly associating the altar with resurrection, even to the extent of this slab-like art down here that's showing the dead being raised to the sound of trumpets. And on the right-hand side, you have a painting of the resurrection where the tomb itself looks like an altar. So you get this strong association between altars and resurrection. And by keeping the relics of a deceased martyr or saint under your altar, you're making that connection even more strongly. The second thing that it does, I think, is it makes a reference to the fact that it makes a reference to the divine Trinity. We're all gathered around the table, and God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit are outside time. They're not part of time's ebb and flow. So the relic of that person that is under the altar stands for the presence of all the saints that are around the throne of God, and the presence of the saints on earth around the throne of the altar. So that's a rather bad reproduction of this, I'm sorry. But here we have the lamb that was slain on the altar, the church on the other side, and the church on this side, making a big reference to the book of Revelation and the end of time, when saints past, present and future will be gathered around the altar of God. And having the relics of a saint under the altar makes a reference to this universality of the church, not being just us living Christians, but the living and the dead, who are all one in God's time around that place, and the saints to come, although it's difficult to get relics of people who've not been born yet. Of course, all of this raises the question of relics of the saints being preserved and honoured at all. It raises a very interesting question, in fact. What exactly do Christians think happens at the end of time? What happens to our bodies? Will all our human bits be glued back together again and given this sort of varnish of glory and eternity by God once he's fetched them all from wherever they've gone? Or is God going to do something else, like give our souls an entirely new and different body that's nothing to do with the atoms and molecules that make up our bodies now. If God is going to give us an entirely new body, why do Christians hold on to the bones or hair or anything else of the body that any given saint occupied during their time on earth? It doesn't seem to make much sense. It's just become atoms and molecules now. It's not related to what God is going to do in the future. Now, we mustn't assume, before we try and answer this anyway, we mustn't assume that we're the first Christians to ask ourselves this question about our physical bodies and what our physicality means in terms of everlasting life. After all, some of the earliest Christians died the most grisly and horrible final of deaths, including by burning. So how was God going to make sense of that? How could God possibly reunite all of these atoms? And, which atoms would God choose? Our bodies grow and they change over time. We lose hair, we lose skin, whatever else we lose. It all seems so arbitrary. So as Christians have pondered over these questions over the centuries, they've sort of veered between this belief in a physical bodily resurrection, that is, God will reunite all of our bits, stick them together and, bring them back to life somehow. Or this idea that our bodies are a little bit like seeds that are going to sprout into something really wonderful after death. And this seems to be an idea that was in Paul too, and it was taken up by Origen, the Christian theologian Origen. So it is with the resurrection of the dead, sown in corruption, raised in incorruption or glory, sown in dishonour, raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power, sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So here is Paul seeming to suggest somehow that the resurrection is not a reassembly of parts that have become scattered, but of a different sort of order. Now, I want to make 2 points in connection with this. Firstly, those little bits of bone and little scraps of hair and whatever else we want to find have been thought to carry what we might call a sort of genetic code of holiness. That sounds a bit silly, but let me explain what I mean. Take Ignatius of Antioch, for instance, one of the great early Christian martyrs. He was thrown to the lions, so the story goes, and his bones, say the early Christian fathers, were ground like the wheat of the Eucharist that he'd consumed in his lifetime. So what these writers are making reference to is that his body, essentially, was made of Eucharistic bread, and it's honoured by his death when he's ground between the jaws of the lions. Or take the story of the martyrdom of St. Polycarp. This isn't just a fancy about St. Ignatius of Antioch. This is a really strong association in the early Christian writers between a martyr's death and the Eucharist. St. Polycarp was being tortured by the pagan Roman authorities. And he said, "You threaten me with fire, which burns for an hour, and after a little while is extinguished. He that gives me strength to endure the fire will also enable me, without your securing me by nails, to remain without moving in the burning pyre." Here's a picture of this. When the fire was lit, say the early writers, it formed an arch around him like an oven. See that on the left-hand side? Like a tandoori oven or a sort of Greek oven where you stick the bread to the sides of the wall to bake the bread. And this arc appeared around him without burning him. And the writers say he appeared within not like flesh that is burnt, but like bread that is baked, or as gold and silver glowing in the furnace. It's a beautiful passage. And the soldiers then stabbed him in the heart, at which point a dove appeared over his head. We don't see that in the icon here. A dove appeared over his head, and they stabbed him in his side. You do see that here with the soldiers. And the quantity of blood that came from his side was so great that it put out the flames. So here you have a reference not only to the body of Polycarp becoming as bread, but the wine, the blood flowing from the side. It's another clear reference to the Eucharist. And what the early Christians seem to be saying about the remains of the saints, about the relics of the saints, because these relics were gathered up afterwards and honoured, is it's really quite simple. God honoured our human flesh by taking our human flesh on himself. And we share that fate in consuming the Eucharist. And in death, we become, just like the martyrs show us, transformed by the Eucharist into this sort of glowing resurrection body. So a relic is this fragment of a promised resurrection. It's a scrap we have, but a scrap that's a promise that our partaking in the body and blood of Christ will lead to our defeat of death also. So just as the host and the wine are fragments of a heavenly banquet, so the fragments of the martyrs are sort of fragments of a promised resurrection. And that by digesting God in the Eucharist, we become indigestible to death. Which is why in the early Christian writers, you very often get this image of Jesus as a sort of cheese in a mousetrap. So that on the cross, Jesus becomes tempting to the devil, and the devil wants to eat him. So he snaps his jaws down on Jesus on the cross to take him into death. But when the devil swallows Jesus, he regurgitates all those who have died, and they come back to life again. So because we've consumed the Eucharist, we're poison to the devil, and the devil can't digest us. And it's a crude way of putting it, but a much fancier and a much nicer way of putting it than some other theories of the Eucharist that we'll come up to in a minute when we look at sacred vessels. Secondly, not only is this a fragment of a promised resurrection, cherishing the remains of a beloved saint is one way of honouring our belief in the goodness of creation and the fact that Jesus took on human flesh in the incarnation. Our bodies actually are a gift of God. They shouldn't be treated negligently. Whether we're cremated or whether we're buried, our remains should be treated with honour by the body of Christ to which they belonged. A couple of images of that. Here's the columbarium, I think in the Roman Catholic Cathedral in San Francisco. So as you can see, it's a beautiful space here with slots in the walls here for the ashes of the departed. You'll find them up at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. You'll see them at St. Bartholomew's, at St. James's Church. We don't have one here. We have an altar, though, where we have some cremated remains, including of Odile, waiting to be committed in the way that they wanted it to happen, which we'll get round to. There is another way of doing this. Here's an advert, reduced price, $104, now $89. You can send Granny to a jeweller and she will sort of set it in blue swirly plastic so that you can wear it as a pendant. I'm not sure what we think of this, but it seems a million miles away from what we've just been talking about somehow, of the sacredness of it has been turned into almost a souvenir, a keepsake, because they didn't quite know what else to do with it. Quite sure how this gets passed on, but there we go. There's the idea, if you like it. Now, of course, the person who muddied the waters around these two simple acts of devotion, that is, seeing the relic of a saint as a sort of fragment of a promised resurrection, or cherishing the relic of a saint as sacred because Jesus took on human flesh, was St. Augustine. Here he is on the left and on the right. He asked exactly what details of the earthly body are going to reappear in heaven. Questions like, will aborted fetuses arise? Will Siamese twins be two people in the resurrection? Will we all be the same height and weight, and will we be the same age when we're resurrected? Will we have to eat? Actually, will we be able to eat, was the question. Will hair and nail clippings all return to the body to which they originally belonged at the resurrection? Will men have beards? And some of these questions he treated seriously and others not so much. And you might be surprised at the ones that he treated seriously and the ones that he dismissed. He thought that we would arise with gender. That is, when we're resurrected, we will be resurrected male or female. An interesting question now. Perhaps he would answer that question in a different way, especially if he was at Harvard Divinity School. He also guessed that we would all arise age 30. No younger, no older. Seems a little arbitrary. Perhaps, young enough to still be attractive, but old enough to have a bit of experience. Who knows what was going through his mind. But he was a little inconsistent about whether we return at the same height and weight as we had on Earth. There was also a vague question about whether our intestines are going to be resurrected, which is related to the question of food. And he thought that maybe we would arise with transparent bodies, so the glory of God's work could be seen inside us as well as outside us. Funny little questions, aren't they? But it shows this unease that Christians have around the bodily and how they've tried to make sense of it in terms of relics and the idea of the resurrection of the body. Essentially, what happened with Augustine, in very simplistic terms, was a sort of abandonment of this mystical approach of the Eastern Church that we just talked about. This business of the body being transformed by the Eucharist, the body being a sort of honoured because Jesus himself had taken on human flesh. And what Augustine paved the way for in the Middle Ages was this explanation of the resurrection as an assembly of bits. Hair, nails, teeth, baby teeth, I don't know what else. And these bits, each individual bit, extolled the sort of beauty of wholeness, and it implied that the body was now complete, it was whole. It could no longer undergo change or corruption, which was regarded with horror by Augustine. So the resurrection body would be an incorruptible body precisely because it was complete, it was whole. All of your hair, all of your nails, all of your baby teeth, all of the skin that you'd shed would be glued back together again in perfection and the ultimate expression of your you-ness. And of course that was going to lead to the cult of relics, wasn't it? Can you see how this has happened? And the first cult of relics grew around the remains of Saint Stephen that were brought to the West. Saint Stephen is the proto-martyr, the first martyr of the church, the deacon who was stoned to death, the Gentile convert probably. Augustine was terribly impressed by this and about the miracles that occurred around the fragmented remains of Saint Stephen. I mean, Saint Stephen was martyred a good 420 years before Augustine was operational, so he was probably divided up quite thoroughly by then. Oddly enough, when we look at pictures of fragmented relics in little red boxes with gold frames around them, we think, well, surely the more you divide it, the less powerful the relic is going to be. If it's a whole body under there, golly, that can do more for me than somebody's fingernail. But actually, oddly enough, the more the bits were distributed, the stronger the belief became that every bit of your body would come together at the resurrection, because every part of your body was a whole. That is to say, your belly button could do the same miracles as your heart could. So therefore, each piece was potent and powerful in itself. So every part is the whole. And this idea of Paul's now that we saw in 1 Corinthians, that we're sown in corruption and that we will rise in glory, that your human body is just a seed and God is going to bring remarkable things to pass in a new way, has now almost forgotten in the Christian West. And instead, the theological focus has suddenly become the preservation of organs and the preservation of bits, and the power of the organs and the power of the bits. So these relics came to stand for the whole saint. So a pilgrimage to see, this is the alleged site of the martyrdom of Saint Stephen on the right-hand side there, with some images of this happening. A pilgrimage to see these relics and ask for the intercession of the saint became a hugely lucrative practice in the Middle Ages, as we saw last week when we looked at Thomas à Becket and the political use of relics. The Christian Church has said that these relics didn't really possess any power in and of themselves as magical objects. They were sort of conduits to God. But in the Middle Ages, they were also thought to possess a sort of virtus, a sort of mystical potency that emanated from them. And this mystical potency could be absorbed by your gaze, by your glance, by the way you looked at them. You know, the tradition of the evil eye and all of this sort of business in cultures, the jealous gaze and all of that. The idea goes something like this. A ray of light comes out of your eye that has been energized and projected by my mind. I want to look at something, and I look at it consciously and deliberately. And this generates a ray that leaves my eye. The ray is projected by the mind towards an object, and the ray actually touches that object and connects me with it. So it's not, looking at something is not abstract, it's physical. Something is going out from you and touching the other thing. What happens then is that this object that you're looking at becomes printed on your soul. It sort of comes back into you and impresses you. Yeah, like a wax seal or something. And this makes a continuity between you, the viewer, and the object that you've looked at. Have I explained that all right, Doris?
Yes, I think that's what we say when we say, oh, I had an impression, or this gave me an impression.
Yes, I'd not thought of that. Oh, I had the impression that. Yes, yeah, yes. So relics haven't ever really been worshipped or adored. They're certainly venerated. As you can see here, this is a medieval reliquary with a king kneeling in front of it and some Dominican friars standing behind here. So they're treated with respect and honour as a sort of vehicles of the one true God that we worship. Here some pilgrimage routes to Saint-Jacques de Compostelle. All of these little places here would have relics of their own to attract those who were setting out to visit this great shrine of St. James of Compostela in northwestern Spain. There we go, a little medieval gaze for you. These are head relics of saints or other relics. That's not to say that the whole head is inside these things, but here on the front you can see this little medallion here contains the relic of the saint, but it's set in this way so that it's evoking your gaze in some way to engage with that relic. Relics are divided into three classes. A first-class relic is something that either is directly associated with Jesus' life. You don't get relics of Jesus himself. You've got the nails and stuff, but obviously he's gone up to heaven. But there are certain places that claim to have Jesus' foreskin, including a cathedral in the Cathedral of Southwark in South London. Yes. I think I once saw Mary's kneecaps somewhere, and I was wondering how she got. Maybe she didn't need them in heaven; she can sort of float. But I'm not sure that there are any first-class relics of Mary either, since she was assumed.
Milk.
Oh, milk, of course. Yes, Mary's milk. Yeah, that would be a relic first class, I'm guessing. So something that's associated with Jesus' life, like you have here a fragment of the true cross, mounted in a gold cross with the crown of thorns around it, a bit of the manger, say, that would be a first-class relic. Another first-class relic would be the remains of a saint, especially the remains of a martyr, incidentally. Now, interestingly enough, certain bits of a saint might have been considered more important relics than other bits of a saint. So, if a saint travelled a lot, like St. Blaise, the foot was more honourable than the head. You might think it was the other way round, wouldn't you? Well, I'd rather have his head, that might do more for me than somebody's foot. But the story of the saint dictated which part of their body was going to be more lucrative on the open market, or more spiritually significant, probably is a fairer way of putting it.
I wonder if it has also an echo of like the feet of the people who would bring news are beautiful.
Yes, yeah. This is a very frequent thing with the heart, the forearm raised in blessing, for instance, and the head. Those are the main pieces that you find very often in the form of reliquaries. The rest can be divided up a little bit more. Sometimes they would be extremely fancy-looking things. The whole foot is not in here. There's just a fragment of it in this oculus in the middle. Here's a very controversial one. This is St. Thomas Aquinas. You can probably guess that his head is worth more than his feet, or his rear end, probably. He was known to be a heavy chap. The monks in the abbey where he died in Italy were rather concerned that he was going to be cut up, or his whole body was going to be taken away and moved somewhere else. He was a famous saint. So famously, they dug him up, took away his head, and hid it in a wall. And in fact, a group of people did come along to take away his body, thinking it was whole. But when they got it back to where they were going, they discovered that the head had been removed, and it's still there back in the abbey in Italy, where the monks initially removed it. So that's what's left of St. Thomas Aquinas. A second-class relic is something that a saint owned, or something that a saint used frequently, like a book or a shirt or a glove or something. Here you've got two examples. Here you've got on the left some soil from the grave of Mary Rose Ferron. I'm not a stigmatized ecstatic who died in 1936. Quite whether soil from a grave is a first-class relic or a second-class relic, I don't know. Depends on how far down you dig, maybe. And ex indumentis from the clothing of Saint Philomena. So this is Saint Philomena's robe or something that you can see as a second-class relic. So it's not an actual bit of a body. It's something that they wore or used. Here's a third-class relic of Saint Therese. This is probably a little piece of a handkerchief that has touched Saint Therese's travelling reliquary. She came to New York several years ago, I think, and so there were several third-class relics that were associated with that. So a first-class relic is a bit that's associated with Jesus, is a piece of a saint. A second-class relic is something that a saint has owned or cherished or worn. A third-class relic is something that has touched a first or second-class relic. That's all I wanted to say about relics for now, so I'm going to swap places with Joris, who's going to talk about the Holy Grail and the Eucharist.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Holy Grail, and we'll see that it's not so far away from what Nigel just told us about relics, because you've probably seen it in pop culture, and you probably have a vague idea of what the Holy Grail is, but it's supposed to be, in today pop culture, the chalice, the cup that Jesus Christ would have used at the Last Supper, and that would have used also to collect his blood during the crucifixion. So that's what we understand now, what we usually refer to the Holy Grail. So in a sense, it is a first-class relic, and one of the most interesting ones. A bit like the crown of thorns, which is actually supposed to be held by the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris. But this one, the story of the Holy Grail, is a quite recent one, because it's not mentioned especially in the New Testament, like the crown of thorns is, and it also appeared in Christian literature at a time which is quite late. So we're going to have a look at that. And of course, we can start with the pop culture dimension of the Holy Grail. So here's a book that really shows how the story and the legend around the Holy Grail has fed into a lot of different fields. Here it's kind of like conspiracy theories and all of this esoteric literature that you can find. Lawrence Gardner is a British author, British author who has wrote extensively about all what you want to know about Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene and all of this. And apparently the Holy Grail came to Britain and all of this. And so there's a lot of literature if you're interested.
He copied it all from a man called Bagent, who wrote in the 1960s, I think. And is never acknowledged by all of these people.
Well, that's a shame that your conspiracy is not acknowledged by others.
Right.
Anyway, you also saw probably this movie, it's quite old now, from the 90s, no? Indiana Jones. And that's at the end, I'm not going to spoil it if you've not seen it, but it's at the end when Indiana Jones is on the quest for, I think he's looking for the Holy Grail in that one, or maybe the Ark of the Covenant. I've a bit forgotten. I think they weave a lot of these stories together to make a whole movie. Otherwise, it would be a bit dry. And so they're using here. That's the scene when Indiana Jones arrives close to the guardian, who is a Templar, a guardian of the Holy Grail. And so you see different grails set on the table. And he has to choose which one is the good one. That's not going to make you die if you drink from it or something like that. And of course, it's going to be, I think, the most humble one.
That's a good guess.
But here you can see them all lined up, and you'll see they have different shapes too. And when we're going to talk about them and the history of the Holy Grail more in detail, we'll see that the question of the shape of the Holy Grail has always been on the table. Here is another one, cultural reference that has to do with the Holy Grail, pop culture. Nigel, you may want to tell us more about it.
Do you know, I've never seen it. My parents wouldn't let us watch Monty Python.
Okay.
But I wish I had seen it, really.
Yeah. Well, you see, there are a lot of cultural things happening around the Holy Grail, and it's still producing many pop culture movies and etc. So the term itself, the term Grail, Graal en français, the term wasn't much used before the stories of the Arthurian legend. So the Arthurian legends, it's a set of stories that were written that we have in French in the 11th, 12th century that probably go back to Celtic regions of Europe, so Britain and Brittany and all of this part of the Kingdom of France too. And so there were tales or things people would tell that have been woven together and written in Old French at that time, and really quite differ from a lot of other stories you may know from other tradition and sources. So it's quite different stories than like the Roman stories or the Greek stories or the Bible itself. So it's quite a different substrate, if you want, that's telling us different stories that scholars have traced back to some of pre-Christian tradition and Celtic traditions especially. But it's quite obscure also, the origin of all these tales. But what is sure is that we have texts that have been written by certain authors, and I'm going to talk about some of them, that are written in Old French and also translated in English, and other texts written in English and other European languages of the time, and that mention the Holy Grail. And the first mentions of the Grail in those texts and in some other texts of the time calls it gradalis or gressa, or probably comes also from the word crater. So all of them refer in a certain way, as far as we can tell from the etymology, to a form of pottery. So it's referring to the pottery, a kind of clay pottery or some form of earthware. That's basically like the common earthware you would have. But it can also be traced back maybe to the word crater, which is the vase in which you mix wine and water in the ancient times, because you would never drink pure wine. So that's probably the etymology of this word, that was quite generic at the time, and would maybe also refer to especially like any type of vase, any type of plate generically, but maybe more luxury plates and luxury vases that you would use for some form of solemn eating or very elite form of eating. So before it was mentioned in the Christian mythology, and it took on this all different meanings, was quite a banal, trivial object. One of the first author to really turn it into something Christian, and especially imbued with this mythical dimension that we know of it now, is Chrétien de Troyes. So Chrétien de Troyes, he was an author from Champagne, and he was really famous in the 1100s. He wrote one of his, I guess you call it romances, yeah. So it's kind of novels in verses, but it's not especially poetic. It's more like kind of the way people would write romances at that time. So in Percival and the Story of the Grails, he kind of turned, or like really insist on a certain object that's almost holy object, and that is the Grail. So it's a specific Grail that appears in his story that's imbued with these quite sacred references. So the Grail in the story by Chrétien de Troyes in Perceval is described as being made of gold and jewelry. Well, so far it's just a very fancy Grail, but it's like any other Grail you have in your kitchen. But what's strange with how Chrétien describes the Grail? It's hinting at the use of liturgical vessels. So he's mentioning, for instance, that this Grail appears with a spear that was also used and associated traditionally with the liturgy, like the spear that the Roman soldier used to pierce the flank, the side of Christ. So, and in the Greek Orthodox liturgy, it's still used also to cut the bread. So you see, when you associate a cup with a spear, it's kind of hinting at the sacrifice of Christ and the sacrifice of the Mass. And it also appears in the story, I mean, I'm not going into details, but it also appears in conjunction with bringing the Eucharist to a bedridden person. So here you can see a depiction, it's from a miniature. So you see here, that's supposed to be the Grail in question. So you see it looks more like a ciborium or some objects that would be used in the sacrifice of the Mass in the medieval period. So it's quite an elaborate object. So Chrétien, he usually doesn't elucidate the symbolic meanings of the stories he gives. So like all these stories of the knights and all of this, it doesn't go in detail, it doesn't explain you or doesn't really make it obvious that it's actually referring to the Eucharist. So it's more of a symbolic meaning that's latent. But his followers, and there were a lot of followers and continuators of Chrétien. So there are many sequels, if you want. There are like a lot of fan stories after what Chrétien wrote. They went 100% into the association, and they would really associate strongly the Grail with the Eucharist and Eucharistic vessels and the story of Christ himself. So the quest of the Holy Grail, a later book, depicts the story of the Holy Grail being used in a miraculous Eucharistic service. So what's a miraculous Eucharistic service, you may wonder, because all Eucharists are miraculous in a way. It is that miniatures of the time also represented, so here you see it, what's happening. I'm going to tell you the details of what's the scene about. But miniatures of the time talking about, I mean, that would illustrate the stories of the Holy Grail, represented the Grail as a chalice, a paten, a ciborium, a bit like we just saw, sometimes covered with a veil. So you see like the people, at least the people who were illuminating the manuscripts, saw the associations and really painted them. So it was perceived as really cultic, as really liturgical object. And so it was always accompanied in these stories, because there are different sequels of the story, with some form of supernatural events, like this one we're looking at, where you see Galad and the angels. So the court of angels appears, the host comes sometimes directly down from heaven, carried by angels, like here, or Christ himself appears in the middle of the Eucharist and out of the vase or the Grail here, you see. So here you see Christ, sometimes as a child, sometimes as a crucified Christ. Sometimes you even have a bishop that comes down from heaven, who was dead, a very famous one, who came down for a last tour and does actually consecrate the Eucharist and does the service. So you see how the Grail is kind of like a mythical object that becomes imbued with a lot of different meanings that are often overlapping, but not always really restricted and defined in a very strict way. You see, it's kind of like here you see on this picture, you see it's Perceval, I think, Perceval or Galad, with the knights. It's Galad with the knights, and so they're 11, and plus him it's 12. So you see the echo of the disciples, and here you can see the baby. Well, it's between a baby and a crucified. I think it's more the crucified because of of the hands that popping out from the chalice. So this type of divine liturgy that's quite supernatural, it was actually that involves Christ himself, was quite popular in the clerical literature of the time. You see it mentioned, you see it a lot of illustrations too. I remember we saw some of them in one of our prayer classes when you see Christ dancing on the altar.
Oh yes,
remember
yes,
this
that's
one?
right. Medieval,
Yes,
medieval spirituality.
Yeah, it was the one on medieval spirituality, if you want to have a look at that. So I think it's definitely a way to illustrate and to give an idea and try to talk about this very complex and indicible, unsayable thing, which is the real presence of Christ, and with the continuation of the reflection on that, the transubstantiation and this very mysterious presence of Christ in the sacrifice of the Mass. So that's a way, like any other, if you want, to try to talk about this. And that's this mystery that the people who are writing these texts and telling the story of the Holy Grail are totally imbued in. All of them are clerics. They're also trying to, retell the story in different ways. So what is important, and that's maybe something we're not so attuned to, what is important for medieval people is not so much the historical truth, as we understand it now, like in this very linear way, and very you have to prove it with hard reasoning and all of this, but the spiritual reality that is in it, that can be in history itself, like that's the story of the Christian Revelation. It's a particular moment in history that revealed the promise of God, and that really made it actual. So for them, it's really this spiritual reality that you can feel through the passing events, through the passing course of history that comes and goes. That's so important, and that's how they also have a way less fundamentalist relationship to stories of the Bible than the one we may have when we want to have a look at them through quite a realistic way. We want to imagine Jesus dressed in first century clothing, and we want to have the traceability of to trace back the origin of the relics and all of this. And that's not really what's important for medieval Christians. They're more interested in the spiritual powers and the spiritual realities that are present in these stories. So the whole story of the Grail, and I've just given you a very introduction to it, allows in a certain way to really have your imagination, your all being engaged in the mystery of the Eucharist, because it's a redefinition. It's kind of like a midrash, if you're aware of this Jewish type of writings, but it's like a rewriting of the mystery of the Eucharist to try to explain it through a form of literature which is really woven into the culture of the people and what people would hear in other settings than the very limited setting of the church and the liturgy. So you see, it's really weaving the stories of Christ, the story of the resurrection and life of Christ, and the salvation given by God, to the daily life and to the imaginary of the people of this period and this region of the world. So that's what the quest of the Grail is doing, and the Grail is really doing this and really creating this strange interface between the different cultures, different worldviews. Another author that's had a really important role in the definition of the Grail as this very enigmatic but also very Christian object, and really closely tied to the mystery of the Eucharist, is Robert de Boron, who is the author who made really the important connection in this regard. So at the beginning of his novel, entitled Joseph, so it's the story of Joseph of Arimathea, it tells us that the holy plate, so the Grail, in which Jesus ate his last meal, so the Last Supper, was the same as the one that Joseph of Arimathea used to collect Christ's blood after or during the crucifixion. Here you see someone collecting, I think it's Joseph, collecting the blood from Christ in a little, something which doesn't really look like a chalice, it's more like a bowl, really. And all the question with the Grail is that it probably, the shape has evolved through the different stories, because the stories are of course not really descriptive of the details and the shape and the color and all of this, you see. So it probably moved from a plate to kind of a chalice, because also of the association with the liturgy. So it's always a back and forth movement that you see happening between the literature, the Romance literature that you see in Chrétien de Troyes, Robert de Boron, and the liturgy, because both of them also became very codified and developed at the same time. You see, that's the same time when you have the cathedrals, the development of all this very fancier worship with the Gothic period too, and at the same time you have these novels that come on the scene. And so you see that there is, I think it's really good to understand them in interaction also, not just like it's actually talking of something else, you see. It's not, they're not just referring to something else, they're creating and shaping each other. And so Joseph, who is here, is also the one that the Gospel says is has led Christ in the grave, laid Christ in the grave. In Europe, you can see a couple of this. They're called mise au tombeau. How do you lay?
The laying in the sepulchre, I suppose.
Yeah, laying in the sepulchre. So we usually used to the nativity scene, and this is kind of the second part of the nativity scene. You know, it's the laying in the grave, and in some churches, I've seen actually a couple of them in France. They are really full sets, and they can date back from the medieval and to the 16th, 17th century. It was so popular to make that. So it's really their full person size, so it's quite impressive when you're in front of it, because you really see the different characters. Here you can see the holy women and St. John and Mary, the mother of Christ, and Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph d'Arimathie, ici, so helping to lay Christ in the grave. So in a sense, you see that there is this creation of, I don't really like to use the term creation, because it's referring to objects that exist in the gospel in a way or another, but it's weaving them together in this very incarnational way in a certain culture to help understand a mystery, which is the mystery of the Eucharist. So the holy vase in this story, in the story of the Holy Grails, become, and the one especially of Robert de Boron, became basically twice relic, because they're closely associated with the Last Supper and with the crucifixion. And what is also associated with the two are the objects and the species of the Eucharist itself, with the blood of the crucifixion and the bread of the lamb that's eaten during the Passover meal. So you see all of this is really woven together in the story of the Grail, and the Grail is really encapsulating it for a form of lay literature, if you want. So Christ, there has been all this mythological reading of the Grail, if you want to say it. So Christ ate the Paschal lamb on the Grail, and he was himself, if you want, sacrificed and eaten in the Grail itself, if we follow the story of Robert de Boron. So you see how there's this kind of transition through an object, so it's quite incarnational. It's not an idea that links the two, but it's the object itself that's linking the different moments of the life of Christ. So that's quite powerful, I think. It's really, for us modern, it's really quite challenging to think that there is this corporal transition between something that's not an idea that gather together different moments of the life of Christ. Because we're really happy to create new ideas and use them as we want, but people may be less comfortable to create new objects and say maybe there's the Holy Grail and it has as much truth than a big truth that we infer from the Gospel. So it's quite interesting to be challenged by medieval thinking, I think. So many Romance writers, so writers of the same period that wrote stories involving the Holy Grail and King Arthur and all of this, continued Boron's novel in the same line, and the story even escaped to a certain extent the domain of vernacular, that is like French, English, German literature, because it really mirrored back in the liturgy, and some churches claim to have the Holy Grail. And one of the famous one is the Cathedral of Genoa in Italy, where Jacques of Voragine, who was the author of a very famous collection of Life of Saints, claimed that his cathedral held the sacred relic. So you see, there's also the whole business of relics, and Nigel has talked about it, but it's also for us a challenge to understand that catechism and learning the mystery can happen not only through ideas but through objects. And we're really happy to use new ideas, but we're not so happy to use new objects. And that might be interesting to think about it. So the Arthurian novel have this didactic value because they help the reader to expand in a certain way their understanding of the Eucharist and the liturgy by imagining it in other settings, weaving it with other stories they may have heard. You know, the stories from King Arthur, that was very popular amongst people with Celtic culture of that time. So it's really linking, if you want, the Eucharist and pop culture, if you want, of the time. So it's doing something quite interesting because it's doing it also in a very elaborate way. It's not just it's not simplistic. It's not making it more simple. It's complexifying it. So there are also, I think we can say also that these stories around the Grail are also entertaining for professional clerics who would spend their time, of course, like writing this type of text, but also participating in the Eucharist, in the liturgy itself. So I'd like to think of it a bit like, have they disappeared, the story of the office?
It wasn't there, no.
Oh, really?
No.
Okay, well, I'd like to give an example. It's a bit like The Office, the show, if you want. The Office, the show, is doing, for people who work in an office space, a bit like the same thing that these stories are doing for clerics of the time or Christian in a certain way. Because through this story that you hear, that you laugh about, you're also invited to reconsider your office space, and you may reread the stories you're experiencing in your office space through these stories. So you see that there is this form of interaction that's quite relieving and expanding also your understanding of a certain setting and a certain thing that's happening in that context. For the clerics of that time, it's a way of relieving, if you want, kind of a passe-temps, what's happening in the liturgy, but also making it more incarnational, more grounded in a certain culture. That's their culture, or the culture of the court in which they're also sharing these texts. So you see how it goes both ways. It transforms and retells the liturgy in a quite creative way, which is quite freeing and really invites to make new connections. And that's exactly what the Bible is doing with all its story. It's inviting you to make new connections. So what these texts are doing with the story and what the story of the Grail is doing is that it's inviting you to make new connections. Outside of the canon, but not against it. So in this line, the Book of Boron also gives quite a mystical interpretation of the Eucharist, in keeping with medieval theology, which of course saw the sacrifice of the Mass as a form of non-bloody renewal of the crucifixion. And here I'm going to tell you a little bit more of the details of how the Grail was interpreted in the story of Boron. Up. So in the story of Boron, there is the resurrected Christ that teaches Joseph. Here I couldn't find an illumination of Christ teaching Joseph, but that's another story from the Arthurian legends, where you see Christ that appeared also close to an altar and is teaching an hermit in that story. But you can imagine it, it's quite the same setting with the story of Joseph by Boron. So in that story, the resurrected Christ teaches Joseph the meaning of the Grail and how it perpetuates his consecration of the bread and wine as well as his death on the cross. So Christ in the story tells him that the altar becomes the tomb in which Joseph laid his body. So you can, when we saw all the pictures of the altar too, it's quite powerful here.
It's Joseph of Arimathea we're talking. Yeah.
Yeah, Joseph of Arimathea. He tells him also that the shroud became the corporal, the linen spread, the linen that the priest spreads on the altar, and which he puts the paten and chalice. Here you can see the corporal, just here under the chalice. Here you see? So it gives kind of an esoteric interpretation of the Grail. And the paten, here there's no paten. I don't know where the paten is here.
It's on top of the cup.
Maybe it's just here and we don't see it. Yeah, it could be. Or maybe this is supposed to be the paten.
Yes, perhaps so.
Well, anyway, I probably have another picture. Well, here we have the chalice and the paten. And so the paten is this. And Christ in this story tells that the paten stands for the round stone with which Joseph closed Jesus' tomb. So you see how all these stories around the Holy Grail have been a way to weave together different traditions around the sacred vessels, and have really had a didactic dimension to it, and it's kind of unveiling also some form of esoteric understanding of what the liturgy is doing. It's really incorporating, if you want, the liturgical objects that became more and more developed and used also at that period into the whole story of the promise and resurrection. So they weave together different traditions around the sacred vessels that go back to pre-Christian time and Celtic mythology. But it's also helpful to remember that the person who wrote these stories were steeped in the liturgy, and for them, telling the stories like the one of the Holy Grail, of Galad, and the quest was a way, like any other discourse of the time, to try to talk about the mystery of the Eucharist that we all have difficulty to talk about. So the tale of the tales of the Holy Grail are really incarnating the mystery of the Incarnation and the Eucharist in places, in times, in histories, in life of characters like Joseph, like Galahad. So it's very common objects for the medieval clergy and faithful that become really imbued with this kind of secondary or like nimbulous dimension that's the Holy Grail itself. So the chalice and the paten, I wouldn't say are symbolic representation of it, because I don't think they would understand it as purely symbolic, but they are doing something, they are mirroring the reality of the chalice, of the crucifixion and the Last Supper in a very incarnational way. It's not through ideas, it's through objects. So it's quite powerful. For us, if we think it's symbolizing it, we're going back to ideas. Whereas for a medieval Christian, it's through objects that's happening. So it's quite challenging, but it's quite powerful, and it's actually what the liturgy is doing all the time. So it's kind of weaving through the liturgy new objects by relating to other stories and putting everything together. I think that's all I had. I mean, these relations are really inviting people to relate, you see. It relates their culture with Christ himself by suggestion that the chalice and the paten are really mirroring realities, as I said. Maybe something that could help us think about it and how it's transforming how medieval Christian experience the chalice, for instance, and paten, is thinking about movies. When you're watching a movie, you're not thinking all the time, oh, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true, you see? You're letting yourself being carried into this story. And because you let yourself be carried into this story, you're also allowing your worldview to change. You're allowing that you're going to make new connections, that you're going to experience some emotions. And these emotions are true, and they're not untrue. It's doing something with you watching a movie and abandoning yourself in a story like this. And I like to think of the story of the Holy Grail as kind of a movie, if you want, that people who experience also the chalice had in it, you see, like it's kind of, you're looking at the movie also when you're looking through the chalice. So the chalice, in a very physical way, is also carrying you in all these stories that are woven into a sense of a place, which is Western Christianity of the medieval period. So I think that's all I had, but it's really, I think, the story of the chalice and how it's tied to the story of the Holy Grail and all this literary construction around it is deeply spiritual. It's not just like an illustration of the Eucharist. It's doing something that's deeply spiritual, and I think can be helpful for us to relate to the Eucharist too in ways that are not purely symbolic or purely materialistic, you see, in a way that's really opening our understanding and our walking into the mystery of the Eucharist.
Thank you, Joris. That's so interesting. It's wonderful. There's more about it too in the piece we did on Celtic spirituality. So I'm going to talk now about sacred vessels a bit more in general. And I want to start by saying that if you're going to prepare a meal, say, many instruments are going to be necessary for you to do this. You're going to need knives and bowls and spoons and pots and table settings. And all of these things taken together are going to create a space that didn't exist before you put them all there. And the space that you've made is this sort of space for gathering people together, a space of sharing, a space of nourishing. That's what you can see on the screen there. All of these have a purpose, but the primary purpose of them all isn't just for eating, it's creating a space for nourishment to happen, an encounter to happen. So if you think about setting a table, say, you set the plate down, but that plate is the start of a process of gathering people together that results in a meal. But none of that can happen without first preparing and placing the plate. So it's a gathering space that our use of all of these things makes for us. And so all of our celebrations couldn't exist without these utensils. The tools that we're going to use for this gathering place, that we create the space with, are going to allow something to appear, a conviviality to appear. Or, in some cases, they might prevent that appearance. We saw that a few weeks ago when we used the Huguenot silver And because it's constructed in a very elaborate way, in a way that's not really quite the way we do communion in the church, although we want to use the Huguenot silver because of its historical associations, it's hard to put together on the altar, and it throws us off a little bit. So it's almost as if these objects have a life of their own, like the Grail does too. So we should never underestimate the power of these utensils in our liturgy. They're so important. Now, our word for chalice comes from the Latin word calix. I notice Patrick has just helpfully put something about the Middle French word Grail up in chat for us, so that's nicely coincided with our discussion of the origin of the word chalice, from calix. And it was a sort of drinking bowl that was made up of a bowl that was fitted to the top of a stand. And this was frequently used at banquets. And so when Christians who mostly belong to the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox and the Anglican and the Lutheran churches, when they use the word chalice, they're referring to this standing cup that's used to hold wine in the Eucharist. And they can range from very simple pots like the one we have at Saint-Esprit from Thésée, to elaborate ones that are made out of sort of precious metal and jewels. Now, you've seen this picture before, but there's a chalice in it. Here it is, up at the top here, that this probably a woman is drinking from, at the top here. Now, these chalices have been used at Christian gatherings since the very earliest times because, as we've seen, this central act of the earliest church was this communal meal with the sharing of food and wine. Some early examples of these chalices are large bowls, or this is not a particularly large one, but then it's not a particularly early one either. Sometimes they have two handles on them, as you can see in this particular case, set with emeralds and rubies by the look of it too. But as time went on, the size of this bowl got smaller, and the base of the chalice there, that little fluted piece that you can see here, got bigger and bigger. And there were even regulations passed after a certain sort of time on how to make these bowls, how to bless them, and how to take care of them. In the West, this is a very large, open, you'll be able to spot that as a Byzantine bowl in a minute, and I can tell you how you can tell the difference between a Western Christian chalice and an Eastern Christian chalice, and why they were shaped that way. So in the West, chalices often have this little lump halfway up the stem that you can see there with the jewels on it. That's called a pommel. And it makes holding the chalice easier, especially when it's lifted up at the communion service so that everybody can see it. If you have a top-heavy chalice that is full of wine that you're going to be using at a busy communion service, and you raise it up above your head, there's a possibility that it might slosh out because you can't balance it. So that pommel in the middle makes it much, much easier to balance. You can grasp it with your forefinger and your middle finger and your thumb, and you can create quite a stable way of controlling that chalice, not only when you're celebrating with it, but also when you're giving it to people and letting them drink out of it. In the Orthodox Church, chalices are often engraved with scenes from the life of Christ. We'll see that's true for the Western Church at certain periods as well. And because communion is received from a spoon, Eastern chalices often have a larger and more open, more sort of rounded cup shape, not this narrow one. Here you can get a spoon in there easy. This one, a bit more tricky. It's like getting the last bit of mayonnaise out of the bottom of the jar in the fridge. Now, nothing can be put in a chalice apart from wine and a very small fragment of the host. This happens in certain high churches. I don't do it at Saint-Esprit. Perhaps you'd like me to. I don't know when you hear a little bit why it happens. Sometimes, if you go to the Chrism Mass during Holy Week, the bishop will consecrate a host, or several hosts, And then you take that host back to your home church and you mix it with the wine. A tiny little bit of it will get dropped into the wine and float around in there, which you then have to dibble out with your finger. This, in the olden days, was a way of saying we all share the same bread and wine across the diocese. So we're all having the same piece of consecrated bread. That happens on Maunday Thursday. The service is held up at the cathedral in the morning, and then you hold a Eucharist in the evening on Maunday Thursday in your own parish, using a little bit of this bread. In a normal communion service in some churches, you will consecrate the bread and the wine, and then just before you distribute it, you pick out a little piece of the bread and drop it into the wine to symbolize the unity of the body and the blood of Christ in the work of salvation. A chalice also is often consecrated before it's used rather than blessed. That only applies to altars and bells when we come to inanimate things. If you consecrate an altar, you consecrate a bell, and you consecrate a chalice, and you consecrate people. But you don't consecrate a book or a candle.
A building?
I think buildings can be consecrated too. And you use holy oil for this purpose, not just waving your hand in a blessing. Now, in the Middle Ages, the art of making a chalice and the significance of a chalice in the liturgy came together to produce some of the most remarkable works of art in the West. Because of this sacred function of the chalice and the paten, these objects were executed in precious materials by some of the most skilled artists of the period. And this was especially true of Siena in the 1300s. It was a centre of the making of these chalices. Here's a picture of one of these Sienese chalices from the 1300s. It has this sort of gilt copper body, that is copper overlaid with gold, and a gilt silver cup. So it's silver on the outside and gilded on the inside. What you can see on this chalice are engravings, these embossments. Can you see at the foot of the chalice you've got sort of raised tracks? These are embossments here. There are chasings and engravements and these little enamelled medallions that you can see in blue and red. The base of the chalice there, you can see it's spread out, it's good and solid, it's difficult to tip over, it's got a firm pommel in the middle and a tall tapering cup at the top. So you know it's a Western chalice, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what you know about the services that would be used at in a second. So the base has got these 6 little petals that feature a seraph with red and blue enamelled wings on those little enamelled bottom bits there. The stem of the chalice features birds with their wings outstretched, evoking the Holy Spirit, perhaps. So you can imagine, perhaps, how this chalice must have looked in the flickering lights on the altar with the candles burning around it. It must have been quite a mystical experience, one that you can understand would fold into the Grail mysteries, or the Grail mysteries had contributed to the mystery of seeing the chalice raised over the people at that sacred moment when of the elevation. Now, if you look at it closely, you can also see the places where it's been handled the most. Can you see the pommel, where the priest is going to grip it when raising it from the altar table, or drinking from it, or giving others to drink from it? You can see that the embossment there has been worn fine, unlike the embossments at the bottom that still have little pointed blobs on the gold. Can you see that? On the bottom here you've got points of gold, little blobs, whereas here the blobs have disappeared because they've been worn down. You can see this is a well-worn object. It's not something that was just kept in a comfy cupboard. It was used frequently for the Mass. Now, at the time when this chalice was made, it wasn't the custom for the entire congregation to drink the wine. It was only once or twice a year that this happened, for very practical reasons, for very practical reasons. First of all, if you were giving the wine to thousands and thousands of people gathered in an enormous cathedral, it wasn't really very practical. Secondly, because the doctrine of transubstantiation had really taken hold, people were scared of spilling the wine. It's not as easy to control as a little wafer of bread. So only the priest would take the wine on behalf of the faithful. That's why it's small. It's a small chalice. Not because it was a private thing that was only used in a private mass, but because not everybody took communion. There might have been thousands of people there looking at it, but only the priest would drink from it. So they became very precious, small, and very cherished, actually. Because of this sort of restricted use of the chalice, it became more and more elaborate over the following centuries, in fact. Here you can see it in action, as you saw earlier on. Can you see the similarity between this chalice here and this? It could almost be the same thing, sitting here on the altar. It's a rather lovely embroidered cloth too, isn't it? With birds and trees and things. There you can see a bigger picture of the chappie who's holding his chasuble from the back during the elevation of the host. The chalice is covered to stop the flies from getting in it. The angels, maybe, from drowning. Here is another chalice from the cloisters, this time here in New York City. It's got a similar sort of design to the one that we just looked at. The delicacy of this enamel work, can you see on the bottom those little petals at the bottom? It meant that with this cloisonné, you could get very detailed scenes into these chalices. It meant that scenes from Christ's crucifixion could be embedded into the chalice itself. They could also bear a text with the name of the donor, like this one does right at the top, just below the cup. You see the little letters there. So the donor would give this chalice for the repose of the soul of his parents, or his own soul, maybe, if it was a gift at his death. So if they were made for a church that was dedicated to a certain saint, they could also show scenes from that saint's life. So if it was the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, on the chalice itself you would have pictures from the life of St. Peter or St. Paul. So the scene of the crucifixion on the foot of this particular chalice, if you can see it's front and centre there, I should have given you a slightly bigger picture of it, echoes the decoration that was behind the altar itself. So these large painted crucifixes above the altar in some churches are reflected here in miniature on the chalice itself. So you've got the big picture over the altar of the crucifixion, and here in the intimacy of the chalice that the priest himself would gaze down on, you've got a similar sort of picture in miniature there. So you could imagine perhaps the powerful effect this enamel image of the crucifixion would have had on the priest who was presiding at the Eucharist. That blood that is streaming from Christ's side was going to be the very content of the chalice itself, inside and out. So the chalice then, this chalice here, has become this place where the past and the present, where Golgotha and the church where the Eucharist is being celebrated are blurred. The past is the present is the past. Christ's blood is there. Christ's blood was at Golgotha. Christ's blood is there on the altar. And the chalice is intended to blur this distinction of time and place. That's one of the reasons why it's such a sacred object in the liturgies.
It's really fascinating to look at it because the whole cup part is really supported by the whole stories
Yes,
and how
yes,
it's really elevated.
yes,
The
Yeah.
embodied part is really elevated because the chalice is so high.
yes, yeah.
It's really
That's right.
beautiful.
It's very beautiful.
And the stem and the floral motifs and all of this, the tree of life and all of this is behind it. Yeah.
They suddenly make sense, don't they,
Yeah.
with these tiny icons
Yeah.
on them, that suddenly it's not just a pretty object that they wanted to make fancy and nice because it was the Eucharist. It's actually bearing meaning, and not just meaning, but bearing a physicality in the blood of Christ, the body and blood of Christ being sort of held all together in the story
Yeah.
and held up by the story, as Joris has just said. This enormous pattern comes from Antioch, and it dates from the early 500s. It's one of the earliest patterns that's still in existence. And it was used in the Byzantine Rite. And it tells you, just by looking at it, it's about 2 feet across, roughly speaking, maybe a little less than that. It tells you that the large loaf to be consecrated on it was made out of leavened bread, much larger than the unleavened flat wafer that would be used in the Western Latin Rite. What would happen is that the bread would be sopped in the wine and then dropped in the mouth of the communicant with a liturgical spoon. So the bread is dipped into the wine at this period and put into the mouth of the faithful using a liturgical spoon. There's a reason for this. Sometimes the chalices were so huge and the amount of wine that you needed to serve the faithful was so great that it was difficult to move them around. A bit like the crater in Greek feasts. It was difficult to move these things around without spilling the contents. So here you have the pattern, and here you have the enormous chalice. Now you might be thinking that this pattern and chalice from the Byzantine tradition are a whole lot more simple than they are in the West. Well, this is an earlier period. But let's think about it for a minute. In the West, the essential thing that is going on in the Eucharist, and this chalice gives it away, is the action of Christ as an appeasement for sin. Here he is bleeding on the cross for your sin and for my sin. Hence the Mass is for the dead in the West, for the repose of the soul of the deceased. The Byzantines didn't go in for that. They didn't much like Masses for the dead. What the Byzantines thought was that the dead and the living are all present at the altar at communion, that they're sanctified by the Spirit in the course of the liturgy. And in the Byzantine rite of communion, the central act is the evocation of the Spirit, not simply Christ bleeding out on the cross for our sins. It's the Spirit that comes down. The Eucharist is this sort of gathering, a sort of procession into the uniting power of God's love. That it all comes through the evocation, the epiclesis, the calling down of the Spirit on all of God's people. You'll remember that comes up in the Creed as well, in the Filioque clause. It's a similar sort of difference between the East and the West. The movement of the Spirit consecrates, not the pouring of the blood for your individual sins. So the Byzantine spoon and the pattern and the chalice show you this full participation in the Eucharist, not just the priest, but everybody. That intimate little spoon makes us think of God's nourishing love for God's people. This huge pattern is telling you all about the abundance of God's life that he's given for us. And this sort of open roundness of the cup seems to gather everybody to it without exclusion. It's more I don't know, generous, extroverted than this, however beautiful and lovely this might be. They're telling the same story of redemption and love, but they're telling the story in slightly different ways, through their objectivity, even. Did you want to say anything, Joris, about that?
No, it's really interesting how you insist. I mean, you showed that the incarnational spirituality of the West, that became also more a question of telling a story and all the life of Christ, and that developed also very much in this period in 12th century, is really present in that one. Whereas here it's more of like a crater. You can see more the Greek crater.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
You know, the basin of the temple or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, the smallness of these Latin chalices here, in comparison, I think it's designed to advance this idea of spiritual communion through gaze, as we saw earlier on when we looked at relics. Mm-hmm. This is designed to be gazed at the elevation, flickering in the lights, and you take a spiritual communion by looking, as we saw earlier on, rather than through consumption, through eating and drinking. So here's another beautiful chalice. Again, you can spot immediately what's going on here. You might even be able to guess when it was made, and perhaps where it was made, and certainly what sort of service it was designed to be used for. So let's think. What does this table setting say about our liturgies and our places of gathering? Jesus said that he blessed one cup of blessing rather than many cups of blessing. And in these great medieval masses, many chalices might have been used on feast days, but many people drank from the same chalice. If you had thousands and thousands of people to communicate, you would have maybe 50 chalices going round with wine in them to give people the wine. The first use of these little cups here was in 1893 at a congregational church in Ohio. And it was a response to germophobia, essentially. People said it was a far more sanitary way. As you can see, the earliest adverts for it here on the left, cleanliness linked with godliness. The most sacred hour of your religious life, the communion season, should be free from any lurking fear. Yet isn't there that feeling concerning the common cup amongst your congregation? If in your church you had in use this beautiful sanitary individual communion service here illustrated and described, your congregation would appreciate this forward step. These clean, beautiful individual cups would add to the dignity and solemnity of the celebration. Not sure how that works, but it's...
That's also very different from the other channels.
An inexpensive service, unlike this.
Yes.
You could probably get 300 of these for that. Tasteful, noiseless, highly polished wooden trays. The noise is also important, although quite what it's like when everybody slurps from these little things at the same time, I don't know. In keeping with the church furniture, outfit adds to the beauty, solemnity and repose of the communion service. And I don't know if you can read it all if you've got a small screen. It's a conservator of health. Make your communion service not alone an uplifting of the spirit of your community, but a real conservator of the health of your people. Send for a free descriptive booklet with catalogue, Sanitary Communion Outfit Company, 457th Street, Rochester, New York. So this is a very, very recent innovation, and it was extremely controversial when it came out in all denominations. This is not something that Protestants decided that they were going to do because they didn't like this sort of business. They did it because it was a clever marketing thing in the 1890s. There have been several other explanations of it since, saying, well, it's much nicer if everybody drinks at the same time and eats at the same time. So if you've ever been to one of the services where these kits have been used, you have to sit with this little thing that looks like something you'd get with a continental breakfast in a cheap hotel in Marseille with grape jelly in it or some abomination of marmalade. And you have to sit there with it in your hand until it's time to peel the lid off and everybody drinks at once. There's a host in the top of it as well, see? So that's sanitary also. You get the host and the wine in one convenient package. I don't mean to be snide about it, although I am. And clearly in some communities this is important, and it's the way that they're used to receiving communion, and I'd be interested to hear your feedback on some of this. Feedback, sorry for the pun. But looking at some of these objects from Christian history, and even our own chalice and paten, actually, the one that we're using at the moment, I sometimes look at that cup and think of all the people who have died, that have drunk from it. Or I look at the paten and see that it's all scratched up and the silver has gone from it, and, many thumb marks around it. And I think that these objects in themselves become imbued with their own memories, with the fact that they've been handled and loved, just like we saw on the pommel of this chalice. That there is something about continuity, about the body of Christ that we see here, that perhaps something essentially disposable doesn't really have. It's become a little disincarnated. Maybe after COVID is over, there'll be a massive movement towards this sort of business, even towards this. This is a Catholic supply company. Our own bishop has said they are haram and not to be used under any circumstances. Once again, it's a sort of disembodiment of the thing, with having this sort of Pez dispenser for your Eucharist business. So I hope we won't have to come to this. Well, I think that's all I have for us for the moment. So are there any comments or things that I know the time has gone on a little bit, it's almost 8:30, but if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment or ask us about or tell us off for saying something we shouldn't have said, feel free. Thank you, everybody. I think we've got 2 suggestions coming up. One suggestion is liturgy and prayer, how those 2 things weave together in the prayers of the church, and liturgy and preaching. So we've got a few other bits and pieces to do. Any other ideas you have would be really, really welcome. But it's an inexhaustible topic. We can talk about liturgy and gender, for instance, and all sorts of other things. So, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And if you're watching this a bit later on, do leave a comment or something on the YouTube stream. We do check them, and we'll get back to you. And thanks everybody here, and thanks for your interest if you're catching up with us later. It's lovely to have you. And I'm going to ask Joris to finish with a prayer for us.
Manifeste ta présence, Dieu de miséricorde, et protège-nous durant les heures de la nuit, pour qu'au milieu des changements de cette vie, nous puissions nous reposer sur toi, qui ne change jamais. Par Jésus le Christ, notre Seigneur. Amen.
Amen.